Hi, welcome to Parrot Literary Corner. This is Dustin Pickering, your noble and honest host. Remember, our anthology is coming up very soon, August 1st. We have pre-orders still coming available for you guys out there who are in the anthology or anybody who is interested in purchasing a copy. Just get in touch with me, check out our flyer, and we will definitely be interested in collecting your money. Thank you so much for the patronage. And if you want to donate, again, that's very easy to do as well through the same PayPal. Today we have Andrew Najberg, who is the author of The Goats Have Taken Over the Barracks, and that's from Finishing Line Press this year. He is also the author of Easy to Lose. His poems have appeared in North American Review, Louisville Review, Mocking Heart Review, Istanbul Review, Faultline Journal, Bangalore Review, another Chicago magazine, and many other journals and anthologies. His short fiction is forthcoming in Fleas on the Dog. Currently, he teaches creative writing for the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga, where he assists with the Meacham Writers Workshop. He graduated with an MFA from Spalding University. Thanks for joining us today, Andrew. How are you?
I'm doing great. How about yourself?
I'm doing wonderful. If there's anything you want to add to that, those little bio commentary about yourself that you want to say, that's not featured in that, feel free to go ahead and give you a couple of minutes to do that if you want to.
Actually, there's a minor update.
Okay.
My short stories are actually already out in Fleas on the Dog. That just came out between the time we talked, and I now have another piece of short fiction forthcoming through another journal. The Wondrous Reel.
Okay.
Yeah, it should be out by the end of the month. I'm actually pretty excited about that one. I've been spending a great deal of time on short fiction lately.
Sounds good. So we'll look forward to that. And our viewers, if you guys want to check that out, just look it up, and we'll definitely anticipate that. And I noticed in your press release for your book, your book, that there's a mention of metaphysical poetry. And do you have any specific relationship with the metaphysical poets as far as poetry is concerned, or is that something that you had incorporated into some of the stylistics, or was one of the blurbs mentioned that?
Yeah, that was the blurb from Dr. Richard Jackson.
Mm-hmm.
And I wouldn't say I directly draw a lot of immediate inspiration from the metaphysical poets, but I actually have spent a great deal of time reading them and studying philosophy and metaphysics.
Mm-hmm.
When I was an undergraduate, I had a minor in religious studies, and I have since spent a great deal of time studying various world religions and philosophical offshoots from them, and those do heavily influence my writing, especially a lot of Eastern thinking, such as Buddhist thoughts, and kind of how it intersects with philosophies of Western Europe, especially the Renaissance era.
Yeah, that's very fascinating. I think that T.S. Eliot was kind of fascinated by stuff like that as well. And of course, he had a relationship himself with the metaphysical poets and of that era, and it's quite interesting how those poets, incorporated various spiritual traditions into their work, and I really find that great. So right now, go ahead.
I was going to say, I love that you bring up T.S. Eliot for that. I will say, when I was an undergraduate, I discovered The Wasteland, and I actually spent way more time studying that poem than I probably have any other single poem I've ever encountered. And that was a place where I started to realize the relationship between things like poetry, philosophy, spirituality, and that sort of thinking. And so it's really interesting to me that you jumped to that, because really that does have some very early seeds in my writing and where I'm coming from as an author in my education.
That's interesting, because I studied The Wasteland. I was given it in high school in my senior year AP class, and we were told to write it. Just give us the poem, we read it out loud, and it was like, hey, sprung it on us, write an essay. I was like, okay, that was fun. That was I had to improvise some understanding that I didn't have at the time, and it kind of prompted me to study it quite a bit on my own. I do love that poem quite a bit. It's fascinating. So inspired, we're living in kind of in a certain degree an unspiritual age, I don't see a lot of, most of what we call spirituality now is associated with like televangelists and, these crazy, do good type people that are not really in line with the traditions of these religions. So, but I see also that your poetry is described as being needed in our age. So why do you think that is, even though there's like that metaphysical element to the poems? Why do you think someone would describe your poetry as needed in this age?
So I can approach that from two angles.
Hmm.
One is actually, as you mentioned, I think a lot of spirituality, religion, even philosophy, and things like that have become almost part and parcel with very extreme mouthpieces. Our current broadcast culture, our current media culture has really allowed the loudest voices to dominate and get far more attention than everything else. And I do think that in the middle of all that, there's a whole lot of people who are sort of, I don't know if this is the right way to put it, but kind of middle of the road spiritualists. Like,
Hmm.
they have their own beliefs. They want the world to mean something, and I think it's easy for them to feel lost and adrift when you see these loud, polarizing voices that seem like they're sort of the beacons of what spirituality is supposed to be. I think it's easy to feel left out of that, and I think it's almost people being disenfranchised from spirituality and
Hmm.
the quest for meaning in some ways. The other side of it is that we are in very difficult times.
Hmm.
You know, my adult life pretty much began right around 9/11. I watched that unfold. I watched the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. I watched, Hurricane Katrina ravage the South. Then we had Ferguson, Missouri. I mean, I can just keep listing these huge monumental events, of course, culminating in the COVID era, the 2020 election era, the Black Lives Matter era, where there's just a tension pervading absolutely everything.
Right.
We're watching the potential, we fear the potential devastation of climate change, further
Hmm.
pandemic. There's
Right.
uh, a big looming darkness ahead, and I think in a time like that, that's where literature plays a very unique role in artwork as well, music, in helping people make meaning of the world that's unfolding before them. I think that if we allow ourselves to sort of see this as just this endless torrent of destruction and misery,
Hmm.
it'd be all too easy to despair. And, if nothing else, it seems like we may have hard times ahead. And, hope, determination, and drive is the only thing that gets people through times like those. And if you don't see meaning in it all, it's really difficult to preserve those things.
Right. So that kind of goes back to a little bit to the T.S. Eliot and the Wasteland, where the sort of the central point was we're kind of like walking, what is it, walking two by two on London Bridge, half dead, half alive kind of thing,
Mhm.
and then back to the spirituality element of searching for meaning, and that's really what the essence of spirituality is, human inner life and searching for something deeper than just mindless consumeristic sound bites on TV. There's so much of that now. So I think I think that is a good thing to note that you've mentioned. So do you address this stuff in your short fiction as well, or is that do you have separate kinds of ideologies or beliefs that you incorporate into your short fiction that you're been focusing on, as you said?
Um, I would definitely say that there's sort of a core message that my writing does contain. I think I express it in very different ways through different mediums. Just for example, talking about a book like The Goats Have Taken Over the Barracks, it's very heavily grounded in the real world and my
Hmm.
observations of the world. And while I would certainly not call it a nonfiction book of poetry, because I do definitely adjust and change details liberally to help enhance my meanings, it definitely very strongly is meant to resemble the real world. In contrast, the piece I have, for example, in Fleas of the Dog is called The Saddest Missile. and it's told in third person, but essentially it's through the point of view of an intercontinental ballistic missile that feels dejected and lonely in a nuclear silo. And one of the main goals of the piece is to establish the reader's sense of empathy with something that we would normally find to be significantly inhuman, not just because it's an object, but because of its purpose as well. And one thing I set out was to sort of explore the power of empathy and our ability to understand each other in the piece. But again, it's through a very different mechanism, because obviously there's a very fantastical element to a piece that explores the point of view of, you know, a thermonuclear missile as a sympathetic point of view.
Right.
And, you know, and I think in my fiction, I have a much greater tendency to explore the absurd, the bizarre, and use that at the same time to try to reflect our world, as opposed to taking the more grounded and realistic reflective approach that I do in poetry.
That's interesting. And so, I mean, I think because maybe the medium itself transforms the way you express what you're trying to say. I mean, and because of course, poetry is sort of almost impressionistic in a lot of ways, whereas fiction, you know, it's a little more long-winded, and you can add in details and get inside the head a little bit different way than you could in a poem. You know, I think that the mediums are very contrastable, but they're also comparable in so many ways. You know, you're exploring human nature, you're exploring, you know, meaning and depth, and you know, the inner life, as I said earlier. And you know, I'm just curious, where did you come up with this title? The goats have taken over the barracks. That's kind of it almost has a humoristic quality to it, but you can almost imagine that I actually having serious import as well.
So yeah, the title is actually very much out of my own experience.
Mhm.
My mother comes from from the port city of Zadar off on the coast of Croatia, and my first international trip was to Zadar, and then we also took a boat to an island that she spent a lot of her childhood on called East Island. East Island is the northernmost island in the Dalmatian chain off the Croatian coast, and
Mhm.
it is sort of butterfly shaped if viewed from above, with each of the butterfly's wings being a small mountain. On one mountain, there's a church, and on the other mountain, there is an abandoned Soviet military barracks. And the barracks itself has, over time, been overrun by the island's goats. It has fallen into total disrepair. All the doors are gone, the windows are missing, and the goats freely roam in and out of the barracks. And they quite literally have taken it over. And a good chunk of the collection is set on East Island and pertains to my experiences overseas. The island itself struck me as immediately fascinating in a very almost symbolic or metaphorical sense, where you have two mountains, and the village is nestled in the middle of the mountain, actually, where their spurs meet, where the two coves are. And you have basically war on one and religion on the peak of the other, and nothing else. And you know, it was very interesting that war was the one that fell by the wayside. And so to me, that sort of embodied the spirit of the place, and it connected very heavily into the themes of poems I was already writing. And so when I sat down to start writing poems about that place as well, the two halves just naturally intermingled with each other, and helped form the identity of the piece.
That's quite interesting. And so there's a very symbolic element to the actual reality of the place. I mean, it's interesting how this you know, sometimes life presents us with these enigmas like that. You know, like you could think of that in so many different ways. I mean, as you described it being butterfly shaped, and in the one side of the mountains, sort of this church, and the other side is this barracks, and it's like, you know, two oppositionals, you know, and contrast with each other. That's quite interesting. And then you go back to the metaphysical poets and how they would throw these conceits where there was a lot of contrasting elements, and so maybe that's where, you know, you're coming from on that side of that. Is there a lot of metaphysical elements in the goats have taken over, or is that something that you employed in there?
Well, there is certainly a lot of philosophical elements that are sort of exploring the nature of reality, that look at the confluences of of things like science and meaning. So a couple of the largest inspirations for me for the piece were poets such as James Wright, who had a poem such as Northern Pike that began with a really stark statement like it was, all right, try this then. Everyone you know and everyone you care about will die of a loneliness that you can't imagine and a pain you'll never know. And the poem then proceeds to talk about his experiences fishing, and it concludes with him gutting the fish and saying, cutting it to a place that I wish I could sing of, I am so happy. And so you begin the poem with this extremely stark statement, the fundamental truth about the isolation of the experience of death, that it's a fundamentally alienating datum. But then he manages to use his experiences to transition us from such a harsh truth to a statement of beauty and joy. And that was something those kinds of leaps and those kinds of movements were something that really fascinated me in my study of poetry. And that combined with meeting an absolutely wonderful mentor of mine, the late poet Arthur Smith. And he had a collection called The Fortunate Era, which basically explores a lot of disturbing and harsh truths, topics like suicide and his mother's death and some of the tragedies of religion and the destruction we've had of, indigenous cultures. All sorts of things get wrapped up in the book, but there's also this pervading sense of joy. And the title itself is sort of a proclamation of the core theme of the book, that despite all of this, this is still the fortunate era. We're still able to be alive and experience. And that's definitely a sensibility I brought to this book, trying to establish, some of the tremendous leaps that metaphysical poets make that you see in poets like, James Wright and that whole era. And that's also tying it to that sense of sort of hope and joy that you find in poets like Art Smith.
Interesting. So who did the cover art for that? Is that an original piece or?
That is actually an original piece. In fact, it's actually on the shelf right there behind me.
So you painted that?
Yes.
Oh, excellent. I like it. I'm a big fan of green, so I think it attracted me. I looked at it, I was like, wow, I like that the design, the way if you can, I mean, people can see it back there. It's the way the lines flow and the, center of the goat there. That's pretty interesting. So maybe you'd like to read a piece or two from the book or from some of your other work as well.
Absolutely. No, I'll actually read a couple of poems out of the collection.
Okay.
I'll start, like I said, there's sort of two halves to the book. The first was grounded in sort of what I would almost call my regular life, my day-to-day experiences. But I also sort of ran into a number of tragedies during that period of time, and those were sort of heavy driving forces behind the emotional aspects of some of these pieces. And then the second half is set firmly on East Island and explores my relationship and identity concerning my heritage there. So I'll read a poem or two out of each half of the book.
Okay.
This first one is called Grandfather, and it was inspired by the passing of my grandfather, Najberg. Grandfather. When the professor tore the readout from the dot matrix printer, it was old-fashioned because he was old-fashioned. We knew we'd done it. We had calculated the number of lemons that mankind would probably consume before the end of existence under current parameters. We could finally go home. Last week, it was the number of snail shells lying empty in English garden beds. Before that, the number of raindrops in a 3-hour storm. We knew the world so well. We tabulated the number of table legs ever wrought by carpenters, and the number of the same sawed and stained by furniture factories. We even knew the number of tears it would take to fill the Pacific Ocean, depending on whether the criers were infants, girls under 10, professional football players, or widows. This is exactly how much you cried when your husband died, we could tell them. This is how many tears fell onto your husband's hand. And this is how many milliseconds the warmth of those tears forestalled the cooling of his skin. Isn't this grand, we said. Doesn't this help you with your grief, Mrs. Nyberg? But she said she didn't want to know. Just shook her head and said she didn't want to know. There were still pills in a plastic cup on the corner of his dinner tray next to the applesauce. The napkin, soiled, crumpled in a wet little ball, seemed like it wanted to soak in all the weight in the world, to draw in her grief and leave her clean. Would you like to know how many of her cells are still alive? But it's no use, she won't listen. Even as the nurses enter in and the orderlies, the candy stripers, the doctors, the morticians, all of them absorbed in what must be done, what must be done. Almost no one hears her whisper that she can't, she can't, she can't.
Wow, that's a fine reading too. Excellent voice for reading.
Oh, thank you. I actually, I really, even though that's actually kind of a hard poem to read, but I also really enjoy the expression of
Right.
the poem at the same time. And over time, one thing I found is I do actually have a tendency to discard poems out of my groupings that I don't feel like fit my voice. If I read them out loud and I can't find a way to express them that means something to me, it's difficult for me to maintain the engagement of revision that would lead to them being a finished piece.
What an
Uh,
interesting process.
Well, if nothing else, talking about poetry, we often talk about the voice of writers and
Right.
things like that. And I do think that's really fundamental to the appeal of language that draws me to poetry. So this next one is called Bach Crater. And Bach Crater is a small impact crater on the far side of the moon.
Okay.
Once you were impact, a berth swaddled in an ejecta blanket, a 27-kilometer eye open to the solar system's outer reaches. They call your crib the dark side of the moon, but it's simply the side we never see, the one that always looks away. And we look away too from the line between can't and won't, build telescopes and satellites and long frequency scanners to extend gaze towards celestial filaments. Because there's simply too many graves to dig, and our hands are made to grasp the shovel and dig, but we've never been the ilk to tilt our nose towards the soil. If our eyes could leave claw marks, the cosmos would bear deep swaths the planets could roll into like marbles, as we scrawl column after column in black-bound logbooks, our data, coordinates, temperatures, telemetries, radiographic, magnetronic maps, computer renditioning ourselves into the folds of celestial fabric. It's not been long since our imaginations danced with the music of celestial spheres, or since we hyphenated space and time, stuck neat little hands in neat little lab coat pockets, and chuckled softly before lighting our cigars. It was and is time to clean underneath our nails. Our glasses, smudged with sweat salt, have fallen halfway down our noses. It doesn't matter how many of our hands don't hold a shovel. It's only our eyes that look away. While we gaze into the rareness of the blows that form the universe, we don't know what really defines a crater, the bowl or the space that fills it. A hole filled with dirt is still a hole if you remember the edges, the same of our flesh.
Hmm. One thing I see in both this one and the previous one was that there's a kind of sense that data alone is not really meaningful. So that goes back to science and how, science in and of itself, without a sort of humanistic perspective or developing some sort of meaning from the data, then it's pretty much just a series of numbers or letters or something. It's like it's just meaningless. And that goes into our information age as well, and how we're always kind of like digging up all these interesting facts and all these little things, and we don't really have any cohesive pattern to them or any kind of meaning developed from them.
Absolutely. It's like scrolling through social media, Facebook, Twitter, Reddit. And don't get me wrong, I mean, I do spend a decent bit of time on social media, but one thing that's always troubled me about it is when you're scrolling through a news feed, you'll have something like, you'll have a story on a school shooting, and then you'll have a science article on some discovery about, Alzheimer's or dementia, and then you'll have a photo of a cat, and then you'll have a photo of somebody at the beach on vacation, and then you'll have some other massive news story. You'll have somebody posting an angry rant. And while certainly it's really interesting to have all of these voices simultaneously coexist, it's
Mhm.
also fascinating that they essentially receive the same weight of scrolling. It's that same motion moves you past the story of
Mhm.
genocide over, somewhere. The same motion will then move you past the friend who had a cheeseburger for lunch. The same movement will move you past the friend who had a pet die, move you past the wedding, past the election. And it's a really strange feeling to have all of it, like it really exposes the concept of information, where each piece of information has the exact same physical weight and the motion it takes for it to pass you by. And
Mhm.
that's both fascinating to me, but also slightly troubling. I think it
Yes.
does diminish some of the things that are really important. And it's not to say that some of the personal stuff we all see on there isn't important. Somebody may be crying out into the darkness of the ether, and that's truly crucial. But when it does come to somebody just kind of chuckling at a cute pet photo or something like that, it feels really reductive. And I think we are in sort of an era of information where we're having a hard time focusing on what's important. And so
Right. And absolutely. That's a fine way of putting it. And I think all of these, as you mentioned, you used the word confluence earlier. All of these various factors pulling together and they create the situation we're in, the modern contemporary situation. And so it's kind of like, where do we go from here? I mean, one of the things I always tell people is like, read a book, read a not just any old book, not just anything, but something with fine language, beautiful language, well constructed verses, something that will make you kind of reflect on yourself and fill you with the fullness that that void of information is not quite acting with you. I think that's a
oh,
way of healing that void.
and to add on to that, I would actually also say, and once you find those things, the poems, the short stories, the artwork, the beautiful songs, etc.,
Mhm.
linger with them.
Yes.
People. I think it's easy to introduce somebody to a short story, for example, and they'll read it, and maybe they'll enjoy it. But
Mhm.
also, I think there's also a reticence to stop and think about what you've just read, and then reread it and see if you can make new meaning out of it, and spend
Mhm.
time processing it before moving on to the next thing, because that's the other thing I find troubling in something like social media or the way we encounter information online, is that let's say we find something that's worth paying attention to. Well, it's really easy to simply move on to the next thing because there's something there waiting for us. There's all of this information out there waiting for us. And so you finish the book and it's like, okay, well, let's go watch a show right now. Or let's close down the Facebook post about our friend who's going through a terrible divorce, and let's go play a cell phone game. And I'll
Mhm.
also say, I mean, I'm guilty of this kind of thing too. I
Right.
don't mean, I'm not trying to criticize people as a whole or anything like that, but I do think that there's a lot to be said for stopping things for something. If something strikes us as meaningful or resonates with us, I think we need to allow ourselves the time to explore that resonance rather than looking for a new resonance right away. Novelty is wonderful, but depth is also really crucial, I think, to our experience and interacting and processing the world.
Right. And I think books in general, because they take so much time, and you have to spend so much time with a book, and with any, I don't mean just any old book. I mean, obviously, like, a novel or, something with a lot of depth and meaning to it that the author constructs, and then, you have to sit with it and really absorb. I mean, I've read Ulysses, for instance, and that took me like several. I think it took me about a year, but I've read it like for a few months, and then I put it down for a little bit, and then I went back to it and finished it up. I mean, you get absorbed in that for days on a page, you know. I mean,
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, I have to confess, I've never made it through the entirety of Ulysses. I've read segments.
it's great, it's fascinating. I've read Finnegan's Wake too, and that one was really. If you think Ulysses was troubling, then Finnegan's would be like mind blowingly like.
I have read exactly 10 pages of Finnegan's Wake, and I've asked my students to read 2 to 3 pages, depending on the semester and how I'm feeling. But
Mhm.
that is a truly challenging work.
It's a lot of fun though if you just appreciate the language and try to incorporate what you think may be going on. You know, you try to understand it from that. I've read it with any kind of aid of sort of an alternate text. I just read the book, and I appreciated like how the language was constructed and the themes that I would see incorporated into it in different ways. And it was just fun to read. I mean, I just enjoyed the sound of the words and the way that you'd see there are all these puns. There's just layers and layers of puns, you know. And it's so much fun, you know, for me to read that book. You know, I read it and I've gone through and read a couple of pages here and there. Again, I actually found somebody on Quora that said they read it once a year.
Hmm.
Every year they read it once a year. I was like, I can't believe that.
Wow.
I don't believe that, but possible. You never know.
Well,
Yeah,
you
they
know,
really love it.
if nothing else, I would have to imagine that the more you read that, the easier it does become to read through it. If you have a solid grasp of the structure, the sequence of events, and things like that, it'd be pretty easy to keep yourself moving and just remember through, the recognition of the segments, what was happening. I can't imagine doing that myself, but
Yeah, my mind just latched on to the way the words and the structures of the puns and I mean, there's this great pun where he talks about, he uses words that are for cheese and dressing or something like these different words for them. It basically sounds like Brutus and Cassius, and it's overthrow a Caesar salad, stuff like that. It's really funny. There's some really charming little puns in there, and a lot of sexual innuendos and stuff that I found in there. It's quite fun. So, speaking, of like, creative writing and so forth, what do you think a creative writing curriculum could teach a writer, and how do you foster technique and individual voice a writer? It seems like this would be almost two contraries in a way, technique and
oh,
individual voice, but they're not. They're really not.
oh, definitely not. There's I'd kind of tackle that from kind of like before, from two different angles.
Mhm.
One is in terms of what people can take from creative writing, being able to affect people with what you say and understanding how the things that are said affect people is one of the most fundamental elements of communicating as a human. And
Mhm.
so, in my creative writing classes, for example, we do spend a great deal of time reading selections of, poetry, fiction, creative nonfiction, etc., and talking about the effects that we believe, well, the effects that they have and the effects that we believe the author intends to have. Because
Mhm.
it doesn't matter if you want to write short stories, poetry, etc. Simply understanding the way our words can cause people to feel emotions, can cause people to imagine things, to share experiences, is something that's really crucial in this world. I know a lot of people in various different fields get told, especially different majors, get told it doesn't matter if you have a business degree if you can't communicate it. It doesn't matter how good an engineer you are if you can't actually explain what you're doing to somebody and in a way that's going to be meaningful to them, then you're going to struggle in your endeavors. So that's the first
Mhm.
thing I always stress, is that what we're really looking at here is communicating. And, storytelling has always been an absolutely central function of human interaction. We do it with our friends, we do it in virtually every context that we encounter. Now, that being said, we do spend a lot of time trying to break down techniques that cross genres, that are fundamental to writing and connections with readers. So, for example, we spend a lot of time simply talking about the image, trying to break it down into how we affect the different senses, the way we can use that to sort of guide and steer the imaginations of our readers, the way images are a major access point to our emotional responses. We spend a lot of time talking about the way point of view affects the relationship between reader and character, the distance between the reader and character created by different points of views. We talk about things like irony, diction, and how diction can generate emotional tones and pacing. We talk about character and desire and how, that's the core of character empathy, that we want to be able to connect with the character's core desire, their drive, and basically that's how we look at it. We talk about, okay, so what can we do to build a setting that is going to be vivid enough for our reader to picture, but that isn't going to overwhelm them with details? How are we going to invoke a sense of familiarity while also creating a sense of a unique place that they've never been before? And the idea is that it's really similar to the way we practice playing a guitar or the way we learn to paint. If we want to learn to paint, we study something like perspective. Then we'll study color theory. We'll study, the different art schools and understand the, pointillism and how we blur watercolors. With the guitar, we'll learn scales, we'll learn chords. And, then as we practice, though, we start recombining them and we start putting them in our own terms. And basically, through that combination of learning a technique and then practicing it enough that it becomes ingrained in our voice, we eventually begin to sort of take control. We take ownership of the technique and make it part of our original voice. Because ultimately, when you really come down to it, a huge chunk of our voices, of our identities, I mean, they are coming from our past experiences. We assemble them out of ourselves, and we just all happen to have unique combinations of experiences to draw from. And as a result, we all have the capability of creating something that is uniquely our own.
Well, interesting. I mean, like it's like a toolkit. You learn a toolkit, and then you can use that toolkit to say put together a nice hobby horse or something. It's like sort of an analogy. You would take you need to know how to use the hammer and appropriately to be able to get a good nail into the spot you're trying to get it in. I mean, if you can't aim the hammer, you can't.
Sometimes you also want to be able to use the hammer to open your soda can. You want to learn how it's usually used, but then you want to start, you want to play. That's the other thing I always emphasize in creative writing is that there should always be a sense of play and exploration. Ultimately, writing is a discipline like any other learned craft or skill, but at the same time, it's also something that there's true enjoyment to be had, and we need to allow ourselves to engage with that.
Absolutely. So who are some of your favorite writers, both to read and to teach? I mean, speaking of both classical and maybe contemporary, if you have a few contemporaries you like to read.
Oh, goodness gracious. That's such a huge question. So I do actually have sort of a personal study in Japanese literature. Haruki Murakami is my current, probably sort of favorite author, the one that I kind of return to and keep rereading. And Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World is probably my single favorite book. But I also really enjoy the short fiction of Amy Bender, and I've greatly engaged with George Saunders as well. From poetry, contemporary. Again, I will bring back the late poet Arthur Smith, but then also Jack Gilbert, Stan Rice, Tomas Morin. Tomas Morin was probably my favorite that I've discovered recently. Patient Zero was a really impactful book for me. But then I enjoy reading the work of my colleagues as well, Dr. Richard Jackson and Earl Braggs. Then when you start looking back, I love the short fiction of Nathaniel Hawthorne and Poe. I'm an absolute sucker for Greek lyric poetry and Greek epic poetry. I've reread the Odyssey, the Iliad, just countless times. Actually, I just came back from a trip, and we spent a good chunk of the trip listening to a kid's mythology podcast. I was driving with my family, and we listened to about 8 episodes of it. And honestly, I just enjoyed the heck out of it because I can listen to the stories all day. But no, I don't know. I have a pretty wide range. Of course, I actually write, I'm aspiring to get out a horror novel one of these days. I have a couple manuscripts I'm shopping around. And I love Jeff Vandermeer. I love Stephen King, of course. I grew up with him. He was a big inspiration for me when I was a teenager. Of course, you know, I read J.R.R. Tolkien. Again, I branch in all directions, and ultimately, what I always do is I try to find the best of what I can, whatever is out there, and think about how I can bring it into my own writing. So, you know, while I definitely, you know, I want to write a horror novel, and so I'm going to read horror books to get a sense of what's out there, but I'm also going to do something like read, you know, the Iliad and say, okay, what can I take from the Iliad and bring it into a horror
Mhm.
novel? You know, I'll read, you know, some historical novel and see what I can draw from that. I'll read some poems and see if there's something I can bring in. And, you know, I do think that sort of that intentional recombination and drawing together of disparate elements is really important part of finding new ways to express story and ideas.
I think we have a few minutes left if you want to, you know, thank anybody out there who's been an inspiration or share a few words with the audience to encourage them to continue writing and reading.
Oh, absolutely. So, you know, thinking about this collection, first off, the goats have taken over the barracks. I do want to thank Kathleen Driscoll, Greg Pape, Molly Peacock, and Deborah Kang Dean for all of the helpful feedback I received when I was a student at Spalding University. Definitely want to thank Dr. Marilyn Callett, Michael Knight, and Alan Wire from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and also, you know, sort of give a tribute to Dr. Arthur Smith. And then want to thank Alex Quinlan and Matt Ermey, along with Kurt Alday and Dr. Tiffany Nyberg and my wife, Amber
Mhm.
Nyberg, and my children, Jillian and Elliot, for the inspiration they've helped provide for my work. And then beyond that, I will say that, you know, just for everybody out there, the world can be a difficult place, but it's also an absolutely beautiful one. And I think that, you know, trying to understand the intersection of those two things, how it can be so hard and challenging while also so awe-inspiring and wondrous, is one of the most important acts that we can do. And I would definitely encourage people to read widely, watch widely, and actively think about the world around you. You know, put something of yourself into the world. If you can make it better, that's amazing. You know, and you know, yeah, just you know,
Mhm.
take advantage of it while it's here.
Right. Very short life we live, and it's full of storm and fury, as they say. So thank you for joining us today, Andrew. We had a wonderful time speaking with you. And this has been the New York Parrot Literary Corner, and I'm Dustin Pickering. We have an anthology coming up, so guys keep a lookout for that. It will be out August 1st, and it's $17 pre-order. If you guys want to order some, then get us and get in touch, and we'll definitely be willing to take your money, as we say. As I said earlier, that will be $17, and it's paypal.me/nyparrot. And you can always get in touch with me if you don't like PayPal for some reason. Maybe it's got you a little disgruntled, ruffled your feathers. Just feel free to get in touch with me. We can do Western Union or some sort of other plan, MoneyGram or something like that, and we'll go ahead and get your order in from that direction. And keep a lookout for that. And thanks to our viewers and subscribers. If you have not subscribed to our channel, it will keep you in touch and up to date with who we interview. And when we interview them, their videos will come up and you will get notifications. And so that will be wonderful. That will definitely be something to keep a lookout for. And you can always go through and share our content with others. So we would be happy for that. And definitely thank you to our subscribers, our viewers, and all the people we've been out here, have come out here and been our guests. And personally, I'd like to thank all the people participating in the anthology we were about to release. And we'll have another one next quarter, or next few months from now. We'll definitely have another one coming up with guests that have been on the show this past quarter when we have that accomplished. So we're looking for 1 million subscribers to our channel. So please subscribe and share our content. Get a lot of people out there interested in what we're doing. We want to make the arts popular again. And as we discussed, make things meaningful and bring meaning back to to the information we consume. So thank you again, Andrew, for this discussion. It's been so wonderful talking to you. I've really gotten a lot out of the interview, and I hope you have as well.
Thank you
So
so much for having me.
quite welcome. And this is Dustin Pickering, New York Parrot Literary Corner, and I am signing off. This is the only and best TV station offering global creative minds a platform. Get in touch, Literary Corner at newyorkparrot.com. And that's Literary Corner at newyorkparrot.com if you want to spot on our show. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful afternoon.